May is a time for some nice weather, lush outdoor vistas, and in the musical world, it's also National Chamber Music Month. I'm guessing most folks are familiar with the term, but in case you're not, chamber music refers to various forms of small ensemble pieces in the world of classical music, as opposed to music written for full orchestra. Things like string quartets, piano trios, wind octets, and the like all fall under the umbrella of chamber music. Why the word chamber, though? Well, we have to think back to the period before the 20th century, before recording and performing or teaching were the most common sources of income for musicians. In previous eras, most composers and musical performances were funded by either the church or the wealthy, royalty, nobility, whatever term you'd like to use. And in this case, the reference was to music being written for a small ensemble that would be able to fit nicely into a palace chamber. So in those earlier eras, chamber music was most often considered a special treat for the elite. Of course, as time moved on, small ensemble music found a wide variety of performance avenues, and many composers wrote music for the most common chamber ensemble configurations, a practice that continues into the present. Today, while we often think of orchestral scale music as the pinnacle of achievement in classical circles, there is a lot to be said for chamber music too. Sometimes the textures can simply be clearer with fewer instruments, allowing listeners to drill down, so to speak, into more complex kinds of rhythms and harmonies. I've long felt that way about string quartets. For modern composers, they can be a sort of proof of concept configuration that can be incredible in and of themselves, while also shining a light on those composers' work for large-scale ensembles. And for some kinds of music, the sheer volume and size and potential bombast of a symphony orchestra is just too much. There are some beautiful yet fragile pieces that simply aren't improved by moving them up to an orchestral scale, where delicate melodies speak from one instrument at a time, rather than being averaged out across a large string or horn section. So let's take a look at a few books related to the history of chamber music. A great place to start is in a book called 19th Century Chamber Music, edited by Stephen E. Heffling, that you can borrow here in Polley. The kinds of traditional chamber ensembles and the kinds of musical approaches they typically assume all started to coalesce in the early 1800s, and this collection of essays highlights the major composers who contributed to the form. And as so many classical music surveys do, we start here with Beethoven. Ludwig's string quartets in particular are considered one of the significant bodies of work that elevated the string quartet format to a true art form, while forming a musical bridge between the classical and romantic eras. Then we move on to a substantial article on the chamber music of Schubert, which was an important part of his work during his all-too-short life. And the great composers keep coming, as we survey much of the 19th century: Spohr, Weber, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms. Toward the end of the book, Joël-Marie Fauquet's article on chamber music in France is enlightening in that it shows French culture embracing forms of chamber music throughout the 1800s in ways that started to transcend class distinctions. The Industrial Revolution contributed to this embrace of chamber music in its way. The manufacturing of pianos became more cost-effective and put them into more homes and more public places where less affluent citizens had access to them. This led to the popularity of piano trios. And of course, string quartets became increasingly popular too, as many post-Beethoven composers aspired to create serious works for the quartet. Then we visit Czechoslovakia, where Smetana and Dvorak contributed mightily to chamber music. Though it's not the point of this book, of course it's also true that by the last couple decades of the 19th century, chamber music was again somewhat less popular among composers, as works of tremendously large scale became a focal point of late Romanticism. Wagner's enormous works are indicative of this, of course, as well as folks like Mahler and Tchaikovsky. And even some of the great chamber music composers we've already mentioned, like Dvorak and Brahms, were also well regarded for their large-scale works. But chamber music made a comeback in the early 20th century, as such small-scale pieces were the perfect size for trying out new ideas in salons and the like. As tonality gave way to serialism, lots of chamber music was made. For another general interest book about chamber music, you can't go wrong with Chamber Music, A Listener's Guide by James M. Keller. Keller discusses 192 pieces of chamber music by 56 composers, from Baroque-era pieces all the way to compositions of the late 20th century. This book isn't organized in an historical chronology. Instead, you'll find pieces listed under composers, who appear in alphabetical order. So you won't find the progression of chamber music over time here, or music in general, unless you're looking at pieces in that kind of order on your own. But what you will find is a great set of mini essays on each piece included in the volume, usually around a couple of pages each. These typically start with a quick historical context for what the composer was doing during the period of the composition, followed by descriptive and not wildly over-technical descriptions of each piece. They're not usually evocative enough on their own to really get you inside each piece, but instead serve as great listening companions, adding some context and specificity to the listening experience. You'll come across lots of fun music trivia too. One of the innovations that contributed mightily to the development of chamber music in the 19th century was the popularity of the piano. Invented sometime around 1700, the piano began to find its way into various scores throughout the 18th century. But as I already mentioned, the Industrial Revolution really helped to speed things along by the start of the 19th, by which time piano manufacturing was more streamlined and the cost for pianos had come down significantly. Pianos appeared in many semi-public spaces like pubs and music halls, quickly becoming the accompaniment instrument of choice over the harpsichord. And then they even began to appear in people's homes. The design of pianos continued to evolve throughout those 2 centuries as well. The pianos of the late 18th century, like those that composers like Mozart would have composed for, were somewhat smaller and quieter than the pianos of the mid to late 19th century. The greater range and dynamics made possible in more mature piano designs, as well as improved action that made things like fast repeating notes possible to play, further expanded the compositional and performance possibilities for the instrument. Ultimately, these innovations made the piano more popular, and also changed the way that composers wrote for it. It even changed keyboard technique over time. In previous centuries, organ and harpsichord players mostly avoided the use of thumbs on the keyboard except in unusual circumstances. Eventually, of course, use of the thumbs became essential to keyboard work around the time of Bach, and by the time we get to composer-performers like Chopin and Liszt, all kinds of wild intervallic stretches come into practice. As chamber music continued to develop and pianos appeared in more and more places, it only made sense that the piano would become an important component of chamber ensembles. Small string ensembles could be adapted to incorporate a piano, so naturally we find string duos, trios, and quartets being augmented with a piano and turning into piano trios, quartets, and quintets. Lots of great music has been written for these configurations, and to go over the history of them, we have a great pair of books here in Polley that you can check out, both written by Basil Smallman. The Piano Trio, its history, technique, and repertoire, and the Piano Quartet and Quintet, style, structure, and scoring, together lay out the history and highlight some of the best pieces written for these kinds of ensembles. In the Piano Trio, we find that the notion of piano trios is roughly as old as the United States, dating back to works by Haydn and Mozart in the 1776 to 1796 range. In Mozart's letters to his father, we learn that in 1777 he was suitably impressed by the sound and balance of Viennese pianos that ultimately the instrument could become an equal to strings in composition and arrangement, leading him and other composers to writing more serious works for piano trio and similar configurations. String quartet writing had already begun advancing to a more serious art form in recent decades, and now those skills could be applied to piano and string combinations, using sonata forms just like symphonies and concertos. Earlier piano trios, however, were generally still thought of as material for amateur musicians to tackle, as opposed to string quartets, which had become more technically ambitious. To some degree, this remained true all the way into the early 20th century, which was when professional piano trios became more common. We progress from Haydn and Mozart to Beethoven and Schubert. Beethoven got his start publishing 3 piano trios as his first opus. Among his early unpublished works are more piano trios and quartets as well. He continued working with piano trio formats through roughly the middle period of his career, ending with the Archduke Trio of 1811. Schubert contributed a pair of trios near the end of his life as well, and both his and Beethoven's approach to the format share the same kind of grand sonata style in its mature form, writing dramatic 4-movement works for the medium. From here, we follow the usual suspects that we found in the overview of the 19th century chamber music style, but this time we head all the way into the 20th century, where the piano trio enjoyed attention from composers like Ives, Ravel, Shostakovich, Copland, and Walter Piston. Ravel's 1914 trio gets some special attention here as a piece with impressionistic drive and some unusually dramatic flourishes by Ravel's standards, particularly around its final minutes. In the Piano Quartet and Quintet, we find a similar origin story. With the string quartet as an historically earlier and more developed chamber ensemble, the piano first arrives as more of an accompaniment instrument, followed by an era of amateur-focused music for piano quartets or quintets that is typically simpler and less serious than string quartet music proper. and mostly the same composers explored these forms. One notable difference arrives in the 20th century, when piano quartets and quintets made of different instrumentation start to become more common. Schoenberg, Webern, and Hindemith, for example, all composed pieces that introduce clarinets or saxophones with strings and the piano. And then, of course, Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time stands as a powerful example of using clarinet with violin, cello, and piano. The new timbral colors afforded in these unique ensembles remain very exciting, and now that we're beyond modernism, and probably postmodernism for that matter, we can adapt all kinds of instrumental configurations to go after any unique sound we might desire. On to string quartets. Most major composers have written for the string quartet, and it's had a lot of staying power even into later 20th century music, where we saw composers like Elliott Carter, George Crumb, Henryk Górecki, János Xenakis, Philip Glass, and even John Cage writing for the medium. And I'll let you in on a little secret. String quartets are a personal favorite of mine. When I hear about a new composer, one of my first thoughts is usually wondering if they've written any string quartets. Although of course there will be composers who simply excel with writing for large-scale ensembles. This reminds me of authors, where you have folks who write gigantic novels versus some who specialize in short stories. In many cases, you can get a very pure, unadulterated glimpse at a composer's tendencies by looking at their writing for string quartets. There's no extra instrumentation to hide under, so your ideas have to be clear and carefully stated. Yet it's also possible to make string quartets sound massive, much larger than they really are. To delve into the history and development of the string quartet, we have a great, somewhat older book that's a very good introduction to this most formidable of chamber ensembles. It's called The String Quartet: A History by Paul Griffiths. Here we have a pretty comprehensive history broken into 4 sections. We start with the early history of the string quartet, heading back into the middle of the 18th century, where the modern ensemble forms we find in chamber music weren't quite matured yet. This was still the era of the harpsichord rather than the piano, and as a much softer sounding instrument, small ensembles too tended to be lighter in orchestration, so as not to overwhelm the harpsichord. It was also the era of basso continuo writing, for realizing bass parts in ensemble music of many sizes, which is largely a lost art today. Continuo parts consisted of a shorthand notation called figured bass, which included a written bass line plus numbers to imply various chord inversions to be played atop each bass note. As author Paul Griffiths notes, the specific date origins of the string quartet within this era are probably impossible to pinpoint, but it's generally attributed to Franz Xaver Richter, and made more popular initially by the work of a young Joseph Haydn. Haydn's string quartet writing eventually established the hallmarks of quartet writing that were to dominate the medium for the next century and a half, following sonata form and generally writing fairly grand-scale works, even for such a small ensemble. So the string quartet was being developed a little ahead of other forms like the piano trio that we looked at last week, for the simple reason that pianos had yet to become so common. From that point forward, we see many of the same composers innovating in the string quartet format throughout the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, with Mozart and Beethoven in particular leading the charge. Ultimately, this book reaches closer to the present than the other chamber music history books we've examined. As mentioned earlier, string quartets continued to be an important compositional platform for 20th century composers, and one can watch the changes in music that occur in the 20th century start to happen in a sort of workshop form in string quartets. The quartets of Arnold Schoenberg, for example, show his shift into 12-tone compositional style, arguably one of the most significant and controversial musical approaches of the century. Stravinsky's 1914 Three Pieces for String Quartet also demonstrate a break from tradition. Sonata form is mostly ignored. Then Bartók explodes the whole tradition, combining new sonorities with extended techniques of his own invention. And in his 6 quartets, we find some of the real transition points into the modern era for quartet writing. In the last half of the century, some of the most well-known composers like John Cage and Elliott Carter spent time with the medium too. Griffith spends some time on the works of these composers, representing the relatively more recent era in classical music, as well as the 15 quartets of Dmitri Shostakovich, which carry an emotional weight that harkens back to Beethoven's last quartets. Toward the end of the book, the author lists a number of significant string quartet pieces from 1759 all the way to 1982. This is a great list to start with if you want to check out some great string quartets yourself. Finally, let's look at a more contemporary chamber music ensemble configuration with its roots in the 20th century, the Pierrot ensemble. While this kind of ensemble certainly could have existed in previous centuries, it took on a life of its own as a very flexible kind of group for playing modern music. In its most basic form, the Pierrot ensemble features flute, clarinet, violin, cello, and piano. This can be supplemented by a singer or percussionist, and for the sake of more complex orchestration, several doublings have come into common practice. In Schoenberg's own Pierrot Lunaire piece, the namesake of this kind of ensemble, the flute doubles on piccolo, the clarinet in A doubles on bass clarinet and B-flat clarinet, and the violin doubles on viola. Other practical doublings have existed in subsequent pieces too, and sometimes the ensemble is augmented by percussion. Several modern ensembles sprung up built around the orchestration of Pierrot Lunaire in the ensuing decades, such as the Da Capo Chamber Players and Fires of London. And when you have ensembles prepared to play within a particular orchestration, it only makes sense that composers will find ways to work within those boundaries. To name just a few composers who have written for Pierrot ensemble configurations: Steve Reich, Michael Nyman, Michael Torke, Joan Tower, Carolyn Yarnell, Peter Maxwell Davies, Jennifer Higdon, Morton Feldman, John Cage, Elliott Carter, even spectral composers like Gerard Grisi and Tristan Murail. The format has been well explored in the post-World War II era and continues to be used today. While it's a pretty flexible ensemble, it's likely that it wouldn't have become such a modern standard if it weren't for Schoenberg's 1912 Pierrot Lunaire piece. For a little more history on the piece itself, we can turn to a nice little book here in Polley simply called Schoenberg Pierrot Lunaire by Jonathan Dunsby. Among other notable early 20th century pieces like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, Schoenberg's work created quite a stir among listeners and other composers alike in the 1910s. Pierrot Lunaire, you see, is one of the earliest atonal compositions. Schoenberg himself hated the atonal description, by the way. He considered much of his work before his more codified 12-tone technique of 1923 to be pantonal, working with tonal centers that happened to shift quickly and outside of the usual dictums of functional harmony. But for the ears of folks in the 1910s, the boundaries of harmony had already begun to stretch into more and more chromaticism during the Romantic era, and especially in the work of Richard Wagner. The famous, or infamous, Tristan chord, for example, is often discussed as a tangible move away from functional harmony, as it exists more to establish a mood all by itself, rather than working in context with the chords surrounding it. So what led to the composition of Pierrot Lunaire? At its most basic, the piece was a commission. Albertine Zamy had performed a melodrama of the same name, setting some of the 50 poems by Albert Gerard to music by Otto Erich Hartelmann. But she was dissatisfied with the result and approached Schoenberg to try his hand at setting some of the poems. In modern times, we've lost some of the context for the original poems, as well as their being set to music. So here's a quick primer regarding commedia dell'arte characters, or simply commedia. This is a tradition that goes back centuries in Italy, and the characters are masked and costumed. Sometimes they're represented by puppets. Author Dunsby points out that there was a continent-wide resurgence of interest in commedia characters in Europe spanning roughly 1890 to 1930. They're the perfect fodder for melodrama. To melodrama and commedia, Dunsby adds the concept of modernism. Schoenberg was already thinking that his music, gradually becoming less tethered to traditional art forms and even harmonic function, may not be fully understood at the premiere of his pieces, but that the public would gradually come to understand it and even adore it. And to some degree, a full century later, we can say that he was right. Some pieces of his, like Pierrot Lunaire and Verkarte Nacht, and his string quartets and operas, continue to be well regarded. And even if atonality in and of itself didn't become the final and dominant approach to music, it's also not charged with that shock of the new anymore. We hear it all the time as an influence on concert music and pop music, and it's a huge part of the vocabulary of cinematic music. But I digress. Schoenberg chose 21 poems from Gerard's cycle to work with for his commission. Initially, he had agreed to write for voice and piano, then requested that he might add a clarinet, and quickly ended up with the final quintet orchestration. He composed quickly as usual, starting the piece in January and having it completed by July, and remarked in his memoirs that he sometimes completed setting 2 or 3 of the poems in the space of a single day. In addition to writing for this novel ensemble, he also innovated in his writing for the voice, using Sprechstimme, or speech song, which lands somewhere between conventional speaking and singing, but is definitely its own thing, apart from the recitative-style passages that serve a similar role in opera writing. At times, Sprechstimme seems quite affected, more like acting than singing, and at other times, when it bursts into pitch-related content, it seems positively acrobatic. Author Dunsby spends the bulk of his book analyzing the 21 settings found within Pierrot Lunaire in quite a lot of detail, contrasting the music with the poetry and looking at shifts in orchestration, moments of implied harmony and form that sometimes decay in what Schoenberg called liquidation. In simpler terms, a lot of what Schoenberg did with Pierrot Lunaire seems to be making reference to almost archetypal level tradition, like the Commedia dell'arte tradition itself, for example, while also using new kinds of language that were very cutting-edge modern at the time, and in some ways remain so. Working with equal portions of tradition and modernity is always a difficult balancing act, and it often doesn't work out as well as it did here. So there are a few books on the history of chamber music, and a few of its most iconic ensembles. If you're interested in more, be sure to stop by the Polley Music Library on the second floor of the Bennett Martin Library at 14th and N Streets in downtown Lincoln, where we have lots of music histories, biographies, sheet music, and more for a huge variety of musical styles. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you at the library soon.